Hi, this is Kyle, and now we're going to look at some ways to control layout using WPF forms. So there's exactly one content item allowed in a XAML file, but it can be a container for other items. And so you can use many tags and stack them the way you can do a nested table in HTML. You can do a nested set of grid panels or a grid panel with a stack panel in it to create all kinds of layouts. This is an example of a stack panel. It's probably the easiest to use. It's basically just a stack of items that exists in the code that you can assign margins to, but they all appear vertically. Fairly easy to use. Not sure it'll meet our needs for most applications, but neat thing to introduce, and you can see sort of how it works very simply here. Getting a little more complicated is the grid. When you're using the grid, you first have to define the rows, and you can also give it properties like margins. One thing you'll notice here is that the height I've given for the first row is 40 and an asterisk. That's done to indicate that that row must be a minimum of 40 units high and can be extended, where the other one is a flat 40. So the bottom row will always be 40 units high, and the top one will be 40 or more units high. And you can see how that looks in the example I'll be looking at momentarily. When I add each of my controls to the WPF form, I can now use this grid.row property to indicate which row the form element should be a member of. Some other things you'll notice here are just the types of tags I use. So I've assigned different things a horizontal alignment. Stretch is a valid option for many controls. You can set the minimum width and minimum height for many of the controls. And you'll see here the content on the buttons, I've used the underscore to indicate a hotkey. So I'm going to have hotkey R on the first button, hotkey W on the second one, and hotkey C on the third one. So that was the slide view. And here's the actual code. So here you can see the design on the top and the XAML on the bottom. And I could change, for example, the height of the bottom row to be 60 instead of 40, and I should see that fairly quickly that the margin adjusts. This should be fairly extensible. Because of the use of minimum widths, minimum heights, and this asterisk, it's kind of neat what will happen when I run this form. It'll allow me to resize the form, but because the minimums are set, it won't allow me to make it smaller than would affect my layout negatively. And by making it bigger, my layout isn't particularly skewed in a way that would negatively impact the user. Similarly, I can move it down and you can see that bottom row stays the same size. There is underlying code with this application, just as there is with a Windows form. This one's fairly simple. It's just a writing to a file. We'll talk about this type of thing in more detail later as needed. But what's important to know is this is the underlying code for the XAML. It can be accessed with F7 or the way I just accessed it by opening up the window and clicking the file beneath. This is just to show that the code here is still the VB code, and you can also use Windows Presentation Foundation with C#, of course. Your work you'll be doing with WPF at first is going to be porting an existing lab into using it. And so what you'll be doing is bringing in your existing code more or less verbatim with some minor changes while using XAML to design a new form. So it's sort of similar to what we did with our ASP exercises. And then later on we'll be building on that. Of course, this also allows for you to bring in your own classes, and your form code can interact with those classes. If your work thus far in this course has been perfect, you won't really need to change any of your classes at all. There are some minor changes you'll need for your form code. Most obviously, the property for form controls that's usually called text with Windows Forms application is generally called content on WPF forms. So you'll need to change a few references to the text field of a control to the content field of a control. But other than that, for the scope of what we're doing, you pretty much have what you'll need for the next little bit of work we'll be doing.